Greetings and salutations. You are listening to the Into the North podcast, where we take a look at the competitive side of the Commander format, also known as CDH. I am your host, Reed, aka Sick Robot, and today I'm joined by my co-host, Morgan, aka Spleenface.
How's it going, everyone?
And our very esteemed guest, Braden.
Hello, I'm Braden. I play the Dandans.
Man, I don't even know how to go about introducing Braden without just levels and levels and years of backstory. But Braden's been around in the CDH community for a long ass time. If you haven't heard of him, which I don't know how you haven't.
Well, if you started playing
at
CDH
point-
since 2 years ago, you almost certainly haven't.
Yeah, I guess. Huh? But at one time, one of the co-hosts of the CDH cast, along with Ian, comedian of comedian fame and CDH cast fame, obviously, who is now in a place where he's not as much involved with the CDH community, but he is involved with something that we are going to be talking about today. Braden, would you like to tell everybody what that is?
It's Dandan. It's the best format ever. It rules. It's the best.
It is pretty freaking fantastic. We'll sort of get into what Dandan is if you haven't heard of it before, once we get into the main topic, but rest assured, this one is going to be a hot episode. I can feel it in my bones. It's going to be a good one. Braden, if you'd like to we'll give you some space at the start of the episode here just to sort of introduce people, sort of get anything that you want out there, any shilling done.
Sure.
etc.
I work for Star City Games, which is a game store online retailer. I make some content for them called Market Movers, where we list off some stuff that happens in Magic Finance every week, and we sell Magic cards. So if you want to build your Dandan deck, maybe you'll buy the cards from Star City Games.
Well, hey, look at that! Look at that! What a pro!
I not even getting paid to say that. Just loving my employer. And if you follow me on Twitter at BradenMTG, I post a lot about Dandan. I talk about the cards I'm thinking about adding and cutting. I post what events I'm going to be at. So if you are into Dandan after this podcast, which I hope you will be, my Twitter is probably a useful place to be, as I'm probably one of the people who kind of organizes the most Dandan stuff.
Hell yeah. And we'll have all of Braden's links in the description for this episode if you want to go check them out as well. So you don't have to go manually typing links into search bars and
Disgusting.
on the internet. Gross.
Who even has a keyboard these days, right?
Exactly.
I just tell ChatGPT to type garbage into Google for me.
just using ChatGPT as Google. So hey, ChatGPT, what's that website again that does the thing? Oh, cool. Thanks.
Thanks, dude.
just treating it like it's just like your random fucking stoner housemate that's 25 that you only talk to when you need random trivia. That's the best characterization of ChatGPT I've ever heard.
Hey, ChatGPT, what are the top 3 Google results for this query?
That's pretty good. That's what ChatGPT was built for.
Cool. Oh yeah, 100%. But without further ado, we're just gonna hop into some housekeeping real quick. As always, we'd like to thank our patrons who help keeping the show running. We have one new patron for this episode, which is William L. Thanks, William L. You rock. Still waiting on the C&D. Not here yet. Next up, though, we have a new development, I guess. We probably should have thought about this one a bit more, because I'm sure there probably were a couple that we could have picked up on, but I guess this is the one that's relevant to our lives in general.
We're very professional.
Yeah,
So a couple weekends ago, we went to Buffalo to hang out with the Bufftown Bullies. Shout out them. We'll put a link to
all
their
their
stuff in the description as
fantastic.
well.
Go check them out.
They put on a little tournament, Battle for the Badlands. Reed, walked away with a Badlands. So
yeah, I did.
You can probably guess what that means about his results. And and I took second. And I believe they're planning on doing tournaments similar to that monthly, which is awesome.
Yeah, I think I already have one lined up for. I think it's April the 26th. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, we'll make sure the info for that's in the description. If you're in the area, definitely check them out. I'm hoping to make it out to them, I'll say regularly. I don't know, like Buffalo is 2-ish hours away.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily I can't guarantee being able to get there every time, but I'm definitely hoping to attend more of them, and hopefully I'll see anyone there. And even if I don't, they are still good events. You should still go play in them.
Yeah, 100%. I think we're also gonna try to drag some Toronto peeps down as well. Next time we go, at least get like a couple of people. We might be able to get Lyndon down. I think Lyndon was interested, so
I just want like a clown car full of Toronto people, just like
crossing the border,
like
go win
3
a dual
people in the
land.
back seat,
Yeah.
putting up the second row seats in the trunk of the SUV, just cram 8 people in there. It'll be good.
Oh yeah. Yeah, cool. So all that out of the way, we will get into the main topic, which is talking about Dandan. So before we get into actually talking about the nitty gritty, because we are going to talk, this might be the most in depth that Dandan has ever been discussed on a piece of content.
Almost certainly.
We may
we'll
be
see
talking about
at the
Dandan.
end.
This is still an Into the North episode.
Yeah.
You all know what you signed up for.
Yeah, that is true. Actually, I don't have to give any warnings out. But you've probably heard us. Well, you definitely have heard us talk about it a bit up to this point, and you might have heard it before. But we're just gonna do a quick breakdown of what Dandan the format actually is, so you have a good idea. So it was a format originally designed. We'll give full credit to Nick Floyd. There's actually a very, very nice Google Doc explaining basically the entire format, the history of the format, and alternate rules and all that stuff that we're gonna put in the description as well. They can go check out. But huge ups to Nick Floyd. I don't think he actually gets enough credit for inventing the format, so I do want people to appreciate that. He also has contact info and has designed like a bunch of other formats as well. So go check him out. But Dandan. Format was originally called Forgetful Fish, or the Dandan deck. And at its core, so the idea is that it's a sort of self-contained, almost like a board game constructed out of Magic game pieces. So you play it like you would a normal game of Magic, like normal life points, normal mulligans, and all of that, except it's a shared deck. And that deck is composed of typically 10 Dandans, which is a blue 4/1 that says it can't attack unless the defending player controls an island, and if you at any point don't control any islands, it immediately sacrifices itself. So, great creature. And then 8 memory lapses, which, if you don't know what memory lapses, is a 1 in a blue instant that reads counter target spell, put that spell on top of its owner's library. And then, so that's 18 cards, and then typically you fill the rest of the deck out up to an 80 card deck, including islands and a bunch of other cards. And you play it with, again, the shared deck, 80 card deck. Typically you play it with wait, actually, Braden, do you play it with a shared graveyard?
Yeah, I do.
Or do you do separate graveyards?
I do shared graveyard.
Typically people tend to play it with a shared graveyard as well. But the point is basically that typically Dandan is the only creature in the deck, and you need to beat the opponent to death with your Dandans while they're trying to remove it and draw cards and do a bunch of stuff. It basically works out to being like a mono blue control mirror in the default configuration of the deck list. And it is a delightfully weird one with a ton of super strange esoteric play patterns and cards and stuff, and it's just great. It's fantastic.
Yeah, I have some other things I want to mention because I think they might be useful.
Yeah, do it.
Usually it's only 2 ofs, so you rarely have 4 of a card unless you're playing Accumulated Knowledge or Take Inventory, which are both card advantage spells that care about the number of copies in your deck, or sorry, your graveyard.
Yep. Your graveyard, and the original version of the deck does play 4 Accumulated Knowledge.
And then on top of that, depending on how controlling your version of the deck is, a lot of games will end with the player who goes to draw a card when there's no library left losing the game. So if all the Dandans are in the graveyard, there's no ways to shuffle the graveyard into the library, or people just aren't playing them, you can also just deck each other out and fight over that last card.
Good old control mirror goodness. It's like it's sort of like control mirror circa like late 90s, early thousands in a lot of ways, without like any of the power. It's just sort of like standard control mirrors, or like type 1 control mirrors.
Yeah, it's definitely like either a tempo game or it's just a like mono blue control mirror fighting over every single card trying to get ahead or not fall behind on land drops.
Yeah. And like by control we mean like true like classic control. There's like no like single card in the deck that's gonna win you the game, like basically ever. There's like no game ending bombs. It's just you just try to beat somebody to death with Dandans and protect them while doing it.
I will say I've heard the format compared to the Psychotog, and like it's just a like hour-long Psychotog mirror, which is what attracted Suarez of Commander Versus to the format. Anytime it gets a little far away from that, he like gets a little disinterested in playing things out. But whenever it feels like Psychotog, he's like laser focused in on playing the format.
Super into it.
Yeah.
I'm adding a category into our show notes for later, which is talking about the various ways in which you can sort of draw up comparisons to convince people to play Dandan.
It's an important list
because Psychotog Mirror is definitely one of them. But I feel like me and Morgan have definitely, and I'm sure everybody else that's trying to convince people to play Dandan have certainly like tried to come up with ways of describing it that makes it interesting to various different people. But yeah, so that's sort of like how the format works, and we'll get into talking about some specific card choices and stuff that go into the deck. But that's sort of the general breakdown of typically what Dandan is and sort of how you play it. But I did want to, before we actually get into talking about any of that, I did want to talk about
one other thing.
Yeah, go for it.
Because I think it's important is when you're playing this format, are you playing it as a spike? I would say yes, it is a very spiky format.
Oh yeah, 100%. It's very much. I feel like it's very much for people who could have been tournament grinders in another life, but just never got around to it.
The way I put it it's very serious games of Magic that don't matter.
Yes,
it's definitely like have you? I forget who shared the article, but someone did about heavy gamers versus light gamers. And it's very much like a heavy gamer game where like. Yeah. And I think, to a certain extent, a lot of CEDH is, too, where, like, it's complex enough that even when I'm playing casually, you know, like, I'm still, like, thinking through lines and trying to intuit what people have and, like, putting a decent amount of focus and energy into it, even though, like, I'm just playing casually with friends and it doesn't matter. And, like, that challenge to me is enjoyable. And certainly Dandan is like that as well. It's not a sort of turn your brain off and like just sort of slam cards.
I think
experience.
If you remember, like when you started playing CEDH, you and I, each of us have started early enough that the games didn't matter. Like I know you had a league at your local store, but like when I started playing CEDH, there was no tournaments, there was no FNM. I'd go into a game store and they'd be like, "What the hell is CEDH?" So there was never games I was playing that had any like stakes or any like meaning. And I think Dandan's very similar to that, except because of its weirdness, it kind of is locked into that forever, which is a benefit to its health, I think.
Yeah, 100%. And also, I mean, if we're doing TH comparisons, like, oh my god, is Dandan like way more sustainable?
Yes.
As a format. Like, you like this one again, invented in like I'm pretty sure invented in 97 and has lived to the current day in various forms in Nick Floyd's brain and other people's brains. And I don't think it's going away anytime soon. It's just just sort of timeless.
It weirdly comes in and out of like vogue. Below, I think this is the most popular it's probably ever been.
Oh yeah, I would say almost 100%. Which does bring us again, because I did want to ask this before we get into like any serious discussion about it. How is everybody introduced to Dandan? Because I know my answer, and I think I was the first person in this episode or like in this cast of people to have been introduced to it. Could be wrong.
I would say most certainly,
but I found out about it from watching an Anzid MTG stream last year, 2 years ago. Anurag, if you don't know who Anurag or Anzid MTG is, fantastic guy. He's basically carrying live Magic on his back right now, live Magic coverage on his back right now, doing like guerrilla streams in SCG tours and stuff like that. It's just fantastic. Definitely go check him out. But in between rounds on one of his streams, I saw somebody brought like this like weird like mini game deck and I watched it for a few minutes, and I was just like, as soon as I watched the gameplay for a bit, and like the other guy was sort of like trying to describe to Anurag like what was going on with Dandan, I was just like immediately was like, I need to find what this is. So I just like went and searched up like the Dandan deck or whatever on Google to go find it. Found the Google Doc, and it was just like, I'm ordering this immediately. I'm ordering like the cards from this deck, and I'm like playing this with people because this is fantastic.
Yeah.
And then you played it with me. I guess I would have been like the first person you played it with in the CDH sphere, because we played it in the airport, or it was either in the airport or at our hotel at Marchesa 2022.
Yep.
And then you introduced a bunch of people to it after Marchesa 2022, like when we were just hanging out after, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I learned it at Command Fest Richmond, which was a little bit after Monarch, which is where I believe you taught a whole bunch of people. And I played it with Cal.
Yeah, one of which I think was Cal. Yeah, and I think Cal took a real liking to it.
Cal loves the format. I talk about it with Cal all the time. We joke that we're like the rules committee for Dandan, because we'll just randomly have like hour and a half long conversations about weird inclusions. But
the best part is it's a totally descriptive rules committee, because there's like nobody has any power to do anything about the format. It's the format's completely contained inside the person who owns the deck that they play with's head.
So
yeah, especially because like you play one person's deck, so it's not even like someone else can demand like, oh, your deck has to follow the rule of my deck. It's like, we're just using my deck, or we're using your deck.
So I had heard about the format from working at Star City Games Philly in 2022, which is like in January, I believe, because someone had come up to the booth asking if we had Dandans, and people were like, what the hell is that card? So then when I went to Richmond, like months later, I was already kind of like aware it was a thing, and I'm usually very not open to trying out formats like this. And I was like, you know what, if Cal likes it, I'll play it with Cal. I think I played it with Cal and Dan there, and it was just a total blast. I was instantly hooked. I don't remember exactly what it was. It might have been like realizing I can metamorphose Is It Boilerworks? But it was some interaction like that where I just went, holy shit, this format is so deep.
There's so much here.
And I just kind of dove in from there, and I haven't really stopped.
Yeah. It's fucking great.
It's kind of insane how much depth there is, and it only gets better when you realize you can just change the list however you want. And then it gets like cracked.
Like people who like definitely like order lists for it and play for a bit, and then they're like, it's like sort of like a spark in people's eyes the first time that you see like them playing with somebody else who has a different version of the deck, and it's like, oh, I can do that. I can just like swap cards out. It's just like, yeah.
I think the first thing I did is I added Narset's Reversal. Like I didn't even order the stock list. I was like, I hate Dance of the Skywise.
Like,
I'm just shoving Narset's Reversal in here, and like. I was just hooked immediately. I mean, how can you not be when you just see something with this much depth that you can like tinker on forever, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's like it scratches like a really, really interesting itch of both like it's like a super game designery way of like brewing decks. Where like you're like trying to work in all these game design principles into like brewing a Magic deck, which you don't like. Usually that intersection doesn't exist, right? Like you're either like doing like custom Magic designs, like you're designing custom Magic cards, and like that's sort of filling your sort of the itch for like I'm like really interested in like game design, and I like want to understand like what makes Magic cards tick, or like you're a deck brewer and you're like building decks, but like brewing Dandan or like trying to like make a Dandan list that you're happy with is like a really weird intersection of them that like works super well.
The only other
and, like,
place
scratches both
it
edges.
exists is Cube. Every other place in Magic, you're optimizing for power or winning or
fun
But this is the only place where your like primary thing is like, am I going to have fun with my opponent when we do this thing?
Like, are we both having fun? Is this deck going to produce good games, like fun play patterns? Or is this deck going to make people want to play it again?
My first cube I built, I was in high school, and my friends always joked that I needed to like make a Google Doc so they could submit their feelings, because at the end of every draft I'd be like, what'd you guys think of this? Did you like this? Did you notice this? And my friends always like make fun of me for that. And Dandan is exactly like that, except it makes a little more sense because there's just 80 cards, so there's less like
Yeah.
there's less going on. It's easier to see like
it's so much easier to hold it all in your head
yeah,
at once.
for sure.
And like particularly with Cube, there's so many interactions that you just won't see, or like you'll see them once and then you won't see them for the next 3 drafts because like two different people got those cards, and like it definitely like supercharges how much game design you can do, because like you need to play like 10, I don't know, 15-minute games of Magic to get a sense for how a change is impacting something, rather than organizing, I don't know, 20 or 30 cube drafts before you decide if you like the 2 extra enablers for the +1/+1 counter archetype.
Yeah, and because it's a blue deck, there's such a massive amount of deck manipulation that 2 cards being changed is like can be, if they're the right power level, like totally warping to the experience. So like when we cut,
like you see so much of the deck every game.
Yeah, like when we cut Vision Charm, the game totally changes, and that's just 1 card. It's only 2 copies, but by not having that card in the deck, your entire strategy changes as a player, and your entire feeling about Dandan as a card changes, and that's really powerful and makes you feel like super enabled, I guess. You know what I mean? Like you're like, oh, I can make changes and they have an effect immediately.
Yeah, 100%. So actually, speaking about the building of the Dandan deck, I feel like we should like go through and sort of I feel like we should all like maybe not maybe hash out's the wrong term or whatever, but like sort of like talk through each of our ideas on like how Dandan actually like functions on, again, like sort of on like a game design level, and like what we think works about it, what we think doesn't work about it, and that kind of stuff, because I think it is like really interesting, and is also like a great place to start in terms of like all getting on the same page.
Sure. Do you want to go first?
Sure, yeah. So I'd say I first of all, like I think just the stuff that isn't really even like person to person, just sort of splitting up how the deck actually works, is that so you can't have damage dealt in anything that's not a multiple of 4 is like a big one.
Mm-hmm.
One of the like really interesting ways that Dandan functions is that the only way to do Dandan in the default Dandan deck is in multiples of 4, because it's per Dandan hit, and there's no way to alter the power of a Dandan. So you can play the game with a D6 as your life total, because you just have 5 Dandan hits until you're dead. So you can just play starting from 5 on a D6, which I think is just like super clean. And I think there's like I think you could break that rule with really good reason, but I think you need like a really good reason to break that rule.
It's a problem people run
like
into when they try to make variants of other card like decks built around a specific card, is that a lot of the other colors in Magic care about damage and life, and so if you can't play any cards that change your life total outside of a specific integer, like 3 or 4 or 5 or 2, you start to run into a lot of problems.
Yeah. And then there's just always sort of there's sort of like the distribution of stuff that you need to actually make the deck work on a fundamental level, which is obviously you need to have Dandans in the deck, and Dandans should probably be like the best pressure in the deck, even if you have other stuff going on, or like the core gameplay should be centered around Dandans. You should like playing the game should involve casting Dandans, attacking with Dandans, blocking with Dandans, interacting with Dandans in some way. And then you need some amount of removal. This can be a lot of things. The classic ones a lot of the time are magical hack, because you can change Dandan to say something like forest instead of island, which will immediately sacrifice itself. The same thing with something like Vision Charm. Vision Charm does it on a large scale. It's 1 mana, basically kill all the Dandans on the board at instant speed. Very strong card. There's a lot of contention around Vision Charm in this place in the format that we can get into later. And then things like Mind Bend, which is the same thing as a magical hack. And then the really cool one is Metamorphose, which is 2-mana instant, put target permanent on an opponent controls on top of its owner's library, and they can put an artifact, creature, enchantment, or land card from their hand onto the battlefield, which has some other uses rather, but is also like removal for Dandans. And then you want some amount of stack interaction. The other half of how Dandan actually functions is memory lapses. There are no hard counter spells in Dandan in the default form. If you want to interact on the stack, it's usually going to be through a memory lapse, which puts it on the top, which means that if your opponent's drawing the next card off the top in their draw step, you didn't actually really counter something. Well, you did counter something, but you sort of remanted it, and they're just going to like redraw it, and they're going to be able to do it again next time.
It's actually an incredibly important part of the format that your timing matters, because if you cast a spell on your opponent's upkeep, and they memory lapse it, they draw it, which can be a good thing if you have a card that's like good for you, bad for them. On the other hand, if you cast a spell on their end step and they memory lapse it, you're probably going to draw that card. And then if you play a card in your main phase, they're probably going to draw it. So timing is a huge part of Dandan, and the memory lapses are like defining to that.
Yeah, I would almost say that the memory lapses are like almost more defining of like the play patterns of the deck more than Dandan's even.
Yeah, I agree.
Just being that like, you know, like the main way that you're interacting with stuff is by putting it on top of a shared library, which is like where all of these like really like again esoteric and super deep interactions sort of spiral out of most of the time.
Yeah, like if you haven't played Dandan before, you might not realize, but like if you memory lapse a memory lapse, and then you have a brainstorm in your hand, you can just draw that memory lapse, and then you're kind of able to cast memory lapse again on the original card you're trying to counter. So these like stack interactions can put you in situations where a cantrip really like reshapes the entire like position of the game, and that is really fun.
And that's the last category that I wanted to talk about in terms of like the core things that you need to make the deck work is instant speed draw effects, which is like where the like third missing puzzle piece that like really makes it all come together, which is just like any like instant speed cantrip. Immediately you can sort of like just think of it immediately like, yeah, of course, like if you're having all these stack wars with memory lapses, like of course instant speed draw is going to be really good and really interesting, because it means that like, yeah, if you memory lapse somebody's Dandan and put it on top, and then like before they draw it, like, yeah, you can use a cantrip to get it into your hand before they get access to it. So it's just like it's like the third big category of stuff that you just sort of have to have in the deck. Again, Braden already mentioned Brainstorm. We mentioned Accumulated Knowledge already. The other ones are typically you'll have some number of cycling lands in the deck as well. The classic is a split of 2 Lonely Sandbar and 2 Remote Isle. And then there's some others as well. A lot of the time you'll have something like removal spells with cantrips tacked on, or you know, like bounces with card draw tacked on, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Repulse is the card I've been playing with lately, which is bounce. It's unsummon with a cantrip for 3 mana. And that card's interesting because situationally, if there are no Dandans in play, you can't cast the cantrip, and so it incentivizes you keeping Dandans in play to keep your repulses alive.
And it also, like, you can save your own Dandan and get a card, so you can, like, 2-for-1 people with only your own Dandan in play, which makes it a lot more interesting than if it was potentially just a kill spell. The classic one that we see a lot in the default versions of the deck instead of Repulse is Crystal Spray, which is a magical hack. So whenever we say something like a magical hack or Mind Bend or any, like, type-changing effect in this episode, we mean you can map that to Swords to Plowshares in your brain a lot of the time.
There's 2...
So it's a...
Sure.
Yeah, it's a magical hack with a cantrip tacked on for 3 mana.
There's 2.
I mean, I feel like you should map it to like murder, not so.
Yeah, it's
sure. It's like it's a murder. Yeah.
There's also 2 rules I want to talk about in terms of thinking about the things we just talked about. Those 3 categories. Card mushiness, which I'll explain in a minute, and are you going to allow players to trade up on Dandans? So Crystal Spray is a card that trades up on Dandans. I'll talk about the mushiness first. One thing that happens when you have a deck like this is that if the card quality is too disparate, meaning like, you know, in CDH you have like decks that will play Llanowar Elves and like Mana Crypt, and those cards like obviously on different ends of the power spectrum. In Dandan, you can decide to put cards that are terrible and busted in the deck, right?
Yep.
And in
you have full control of that.
What's that?
Yeah, you have full control of that. You you can just
So a card like Mystical Tutor is kind of famously bad in Dandan. Most of us agree the card kind of sucks. It does some cool stuff where it instant speed shuffles, and if your opponent taps out, you can just punish the shit out of them. But
or if they're just like if somebody's empty-handed, you're just like, okay, time walk you, time walk you.
But a lot of times Mystical Tutor is just pretty bad. If having 2 Mystical Tutors is like not something you want, for example. So that card might be pretty bad. And then you might have something like Accumulated Knowledge, where the 4th Accumulated Knowledge is like the best card in the deck by like a massive margin most of the time.
Yeah.
In some of the earlier versions of the deck, I feel like the cards weren't as mushy, meaning like there were cards on more extreme ends of the deck. And by making the card quality mushier, meaning like the things at the ends are closer to each other, you make the game feel kind of more like chess, where the amount of variance goes down and the games are more about your like individual decisions and less about, did I draw like 2 Mystical Tutors or 2 Dance of the Skywise? And so a decision you can make as a Dandan builder is like, do I want the deck to feel variant in that there are cards like Dance of the Skywise, which is a card that only counters Mind Bend and Magical Hack and Crystal Spray. It's just 2 mana. Your Dandan loses all abilities. That means it doesn't die to a removal spell this turn. But if you don't have any Dandans, that card's pretty terrible. Or do you want to include cards like I can just pull up my list real quick. I don't know, Narcissus Reversal, where Narcissus Reversal can double up one of your spells. It can act as a counter spell if your opponent's tapped out. It can let you do some cool stuff with Accumulated Knowledge. It's a pretty like busted card. It's very mushy. The only cards it doesn't really interact with are the Dandans, and that's fine. Yep. So you can replace Dance of the Skywise with an Narcissus Reversal, which is kind of the same thing. It lets you do some interesting stuff. And the card quality gets mushier, but it also means that like your players' decisions probably matter more, which is not a good experience if your players are like worse at the game. So that's something to think about. I don't know. Do either of you have thoughts on that?
It's actually funny that you use mushy, because I would probably just like same descriptor, I would just use it in reverse as like spikier cards.
Sure.
But I like fully understand. Yeah. Whichever way you think about it. Yeah. I mostly agree, actually. I think like it's sort of like making the deck mushier, sort of or less spiky, sort of moves it to a place where it's a lot more skill testing, or not even necessarily, well, still skill testing, but like more you have to be very aware of, what's in the deck and like what certain interactions are, as opposed to just being able to like slam super powerful cards and just like hope that a memory lapse is enough. That being said, I do think there is I think there's such a thing as making a Dandan deck like too mushy, too not spiky, to the point where you don't get a lot of like really engaging gameplay around some of these cards. Because if every card in the deck is around the same power level and sort of like trades on a very equivalent axis in terms of like card advantage and board advantage, etc., you can get to a point where it is not just ambiguous if you should be spending resources in a certain way, but almost like doesn't matter if you spend resources in a certain way, as long as you're like trading resources at all.
I think you're absolutely right.
Which sort of like takes some skill and like some play out of the format. So like you do, to a certain degree, you need the deck to have cards that are clearly better than other cards and have cards that are clearly worse than other cards. But it's more about like tuning where those ends are rather than just collapsing them to a single line.
Can I actually do you have anything you want to add to this? Because I actually think it ties into the next topic really well.
On mushiness and spikiness, not especially. Cool. I guess I would just say that like I do think that like one of the things that makes the format fun is the blowouts, and I think you need a certain amount of spikiness for those
Sure.
to materialize.
Yeah, and I think like for example, supplant form is a very spiky or not mushy card, right?
Yes.
It's a lot of mana. It barely does anything. It can occasionally 2-for-1, but it leads to like some of the biggest blowouts in the deck. But I think because the card can 2-for-1, and you can back it up with like cards like Narset's Reversal, it's like it's worth being there and maintains a level of like spikiness that you want, because you don't want to get rid of all of it.
Well, and it's also like a lot of the time, possibly the only card in the deck that can produce killing board states by surprise.
Yes.
Because with any other card in the deck, any other play pattern, you see the Dandan coming. It gets cast, they have to wait a turn, it gets in at you the next turn. So you have a turn to acknowledge the Dandan coming down so you can interact with it on the stack. And then you have a turn of draw, untap, I have all of my mana, all of the resources available to me to deal with this Dandan, or decide that I don't want to deal with this Dandan. Supplant form is like the one card in the deck that can break that by being like, okay, you thought that I didn't have Dandans or anything, you thought that you were good to go, you did all your stuff, and then in your end step, I'm going to make a Dandan and then untap and immediately hit you with it.
So the thing we were talking about with spikiness and how sometimes it can be better to just not act, because the exchanging of resources, like what all the game is about, is the other thing I was talking about, where you can talk about cards like Crystal Spray and Vision Charm. The better pressure is in the deck, the easier it is for a player to see their position in terms of the cards in hand and decide that they're going to be the player that applies pressure this game and force the other player to act. And so when you cut the cards like Crystal Spray and Vision Charm, you make it so that Dandans can't be traded with in a beneficial way, meaning like killing a Dandan doesn't draw you a card, or it doesn't put you up on cards. It means that pressure is as generically like good and actually can test an opponent, where if they just don't have the removal spells or the Dandans to block with, they just die. And so if you're going to make the deck less spiky and more mushy, a way you can offset that like lack of decisions being beneficial is by making Dandans contextually better in the deck, because there are draws where you can force your opponent to act in ways that are not actually like objectively the best, but they have to just to survive long enough to be able to start pulling ahead with the cards they have in their hand. And I think that's why these two things work together really well, is because if you go too mushy, pressure can kind of dig you out of that problem, where if you want things to be spiky and you don't really care about Dandans being important to the game, you can kind of do that.
Because it's all about cards, yeah.
What's that?
Because it's all about cards, which is like just to be clear to our like listeners who maybe have never played Dandan before, the two separate axes of pressure that you have to account for.
Because
anyway,
you're absolutely right. Because in Dandan there are two forms of pressure: card advantage and life totals. It's true in Magic too, really, but like in Dandan it's just so degenerated.
Dandan, it's like super binary. It's super binary.
Yeah.
It's you have 5 Dandan hits in you. And then you also need to be at card parity or above with your opponent to win the game.
It's very hard to do both. It's hard to stay ahead, and it's hard to stay ahead while also having these cards on board that in most Dandan lists are pretty easy to answer.
Yeah.
So yeah. Hopefully that's useful.
Dude, I think that was a fantastic discussion about sort of like some of the large deck building concepts for sort of like evaluating how you build Dandan and like what sort of play patterns you're looking for.
Yeah, it is like a build your own experience, right? And so understanding like what are the axes you're actually like building your deck on is one of the first things you have to like think about as you make decisions.
So I think we sort of got to the point, so like we've sort of gotten through like how you produce fun games out of a Dandan deck and sort of like what produces fun games, like good play patterns in a bit. I did want to get into sort of like what ruins all of the stuff that we just talked about, and like stuff that's like sort of in each of our opinions like actively bad. for example, this one I'll throw out a controversial one early here just to sort of set the tone a bit. In my personal opinion, I think something that sort of makes the deck less fun or less interesting in general is actually the prevalence or the playing at all of effects that search the library. I am actually sort of a purist on. I've become sort of a purist on this for at least my own Dandan experience, which is that, in my opinion, I think having cards in the deck that actively search the library, such as Mystical Tutor, is the only one in the default list. But again, people are playing stuff like Floodplains or Fetch Lands or stuff like that. I think there's a problem with those, that they both, there's not a huge amount of upside, and they also make the gameplay slower. There are some iffy edge cases with it, and it just like makes the format less clean overall.
I think you're absolutely right. I will say this as a person with 2 tutors in their Dandan deck. I think this is like a rule 0 situation. So like, I know which might sound ridiculous, but if you're playing with people at a bar, which I do a lot, I'm gonna like if we've got like 40 cards left in the deck and they're like looking through the deck to get my hand, I'm just gonna be like, dude, really? Like, we're at a bar right now. Let's relax a little bit.
But it's the fact that like those effects expose that at all.
I think you're right.
Like that is just a possibility.
I think you're absolutely right.
That, like, you can just like cast a search or like search library, and then you can just like, okay, I'm just looking at the library now, and I can just sort of figure out what your hand is.
I think you're right.
Is that what you're saying the problem is, or like
that's a contributing factor to the issue. I also think that there's issues in terms of like I think there's something like less clean and like not as skill testing about being able to like have a card in the deck that can find you the perfect thing for that situation. I think there's a level of you just sort of have to operate on what the deck gives you, and I think setting that up beyond scrying and rearranging at all sort of puts you at a point where it's like, again, you lose some of the gameplay, some of the complexity, some of the like feel of the format.
That's interesting to me.
So I definitely disagree there.
Yeah, I disagree as well.
I think I think I'm on board with like the whole searching the library with a shared library is like an iffy space. And if there was like, you know, if I was programming like an online version of play, you would just like type in the card you wanted to find with Mystical Tutor, and it would be like, here it is. You don't get to see what's left in the deck, sure. Right? But I do think that like Mystical Tutor particularly, or like that sort of effect, I do actually think that creates like some higher skill like situations. I think it would be not good to have like solve the equation where it just goes directly to your hand, but the fact that you can tutor something to the top of the library and then like you're like, oh, I'm behind on cards and there's 2 AKs in the bin, like I'll just mystical for AK, but you have to set it up right, because like you mystical for AK, you go to your turn, your opponent's like, oh, I'll cycle this Lonely Sandbar, thanks for the 3rd AK.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, so I definitely agree that like, yeah, Mystical Tutor like is in the original deck and is in like most people's Dandan decks, because obviously there are skill testing fun play patterns around that card. But I like personally think that like it's for me it's not worth the downsides. Oh, sorry. The last contributing factor for me as well is that they make the game much more difficult for new people to get into.
I think
because you basically have to hand them the deck and be like, you need to read through all these cards in the eventuality that you like have a Mystical Tutor, so that you can actually evaluate what the Mystical Tutor in your hand.
Yeah, I think that's probably
which is like super like that's like super not fun for people getting into it for the first time.
I think it's slightly different than that, but very close. I think the problem is I think Floodplain's perfect. If we're being totally honest, I think Floodplain's the exact kind of tutor I want in the deck. It finds 2 things: finds a basic island or finds a Mystic Sanctuary. And the Mystic Sanctuary is interesting because sometimes you go get it even though you don't want to use it because you want to deny your opponent that draw. I think that's interesting. Also, sometimes you use it to set up really difficult turns, and you can use it to disrupt a Mystic Retrieval. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff happening there. But I think with Mystical Tutor, everything you've said is totally accurate. I think a 1-mana instant that gives you perfect information is like kind of weird. I think the fact that it's so hard for new players to play is kind of weird. I think the fact that it's secretly a very bad card most of the time is interesting and is like part of the appeal of the format to me. But the fact that that is not very obvious to most people who are playing Dandan is a problem for new players. And I definitely think everything you're saying that I've mentioned just now, I agree with. However, I'm not sure if I would like cut Mystical Tutor over it, although Cal has, and I don't blame Cal for that really at all.
I honestly, of the things you said, I think the new player argument is actually the one that I buy the most, because certainly I've experienced that with like half the new people I've played with, where they like cast Mystical Tutor and they're like, what do I find? And I'm like,
Yep.
That is an excellent
question.
I
agree.
But
you're right.
I do think it's actually, I think I enjoy it when I'm playing with people who are experienced. Like, I obviously setting aside the like the perfect information aspect, and like generally what I'll do when I'm resolving a Mystical Tutor is I'll like declare what I'm getting, and then I'll just flip through until I see that card, and then I'll stop, and hopefully that means there's still like half the deck that I didn't see. I've honestly considered a couple of times playing with my friends, proposing the rule that like that is just how the card works, and both players get to see the cards.
Have you
to make it like a less of a gain a bunch of
just
information
another thing
card?
You could do?
Both people's reveal their hands or something.
Another thing you could do is play like 85 cards instead of 80 cards, or like 82 cards,
and just take 5 of them out.
And just take out like 10 random cards at the beginning of the game.
Yeah.
And now
I think me and Morgan have actually had discussions about like similar things about like just having like swap boards for a Dandan deck ready to go.
I do currently.
Just, like,
I keep
sort of at random just do like shuffled swap boards.
I see.
For,
I do
Dandan
keep
decks.
like sideboards of Dandans for Dandan. Like I have these Gone Missings on my desk right now. I have Crystal Sprays and Piracy Charms and tons of like cards that are almost cards I want in my Dandan deck. I just keep them on me for when I'm at like events and I'm with Cal and it's like, hey Cal, I want to try out this card, and then we play some games. So I think you could definitely do that.
Yeah. Anyway, that was like one of the things for me that sort of like for me personally that sort of like takes away or detracts from the Dandan experience. I'm sure you both have some of your own.
For me it's just lands, like people making land drops. If you miss your 4th land drop, you're probably dead. Obviously, I think most people play with a free mulligan if you have less than 2 lands. We play with that. I've considered upping the land count, just cutting like Mystical Tutor for another set of like Triomes or something, another cycle land. But or even like a blue-white dual land or something, or I don't want it to be another red source because I don't want to mess with that. But just
we can get into that full discussion in a second. Yeah, Morgan, you can bring that one up on your
Interestingly, one of the variants on the website is before you draw hands, take out 4 islands, and each player just starts with 2 untapped islands in play.
That's interesting. I mean, I had a friend literally discuss doing that, and I just think I would just rather play the non-games and just like me and Cal, when we play, we usually play like, let's say we play 6 games. Like 3 of the games are over by turn 3. We just shuffle up and start a new game. But that's because me and Cal like have a pretty good idea of like when we play together. We're the only two. We play with each other so much that we have a pretty good idea of what we're doing, and we both can kind of just go like, "Oh yeah, you're not doing very well, are you?" And then, just shuffle up and restart.
just so big brain of like, I know you're thinking you can kill my Dandan with the mind bend you're gonna draw in 2 turns, but you fail to consider is that
we do that. Like it's not exactly that, but sometimes it's like, hey Cal, is this your hand? And Cal's like, yeah, and I'm like, this is my hand. Then we concede, and it goes both ways. Like Cal will do it to me.
I definitely like. I don't enjoy, like, I mean, I have conceded to, like, I had the pressure, I got Reed down to, like, 1 Dandan hit, and then he killed all my Dandans, and he had 6 cards in hand, and I had 1, and I was like, I'm not.
Over.
All right,
they're like, you got it. But, like, certainly, I think, and this is something why I don't want to get it, why I wasn't necessarily on board with making it too non-spiky, is that like I've definitely had some games where it was like, oh, I was so dead, and then I managed to like force them to tap low, or like I induced them to tap low on their end step, and then like untapped and slammed the diminishing returns, and then like they didn't draw a great hand off the diminishing returns, and I was able to like claw my way back into it. And to me, that's awesome.
Yeah, I definitely. It's not like those games don't happen when we play. It's just like you don't always need to play it out when someone's ahead by like 3 cards in Dandan. It's pretty hard to come back from that, especially if you start missing land drops.
Yeah, the missing land drops is sort of the death sentence a lot of the time. It's just like, oh, I'm just okay.
When I'm teaching people, I'll just give them like an extra land every once in a while if they're having a hard time. Just be like, hey, just take this land. It'll solve a lot of these problems you're having.
It's actually like super decent. I just yeah, I guess that's like that might be an idiosyncrasy for me, or maybe it's just how it works for most people. But like whenever I'm teaching game systems, one of my great flaws is that I just like sort of like don't deviate from how you actually play the game.
Yeah,
enough of the time.
Some people,
which like tends to be like a bad learning experience for a lot of people, where it's just like we could just skip over the shitty part of this and then like keep doing the fun thing while you're still learning.
You can usually like, there's 2 types of people in my experience with Dandan when I'm teaching them. There's people who I teach them, and I'm like, oh, you've played Legacy Delver before, you're gonna get this.
You get.
And then there's people who like have only ever played Commander before, not even CDH, and it's like, oh, I have to like kind of walk you through this because you don't have a understanding of card advantage. Yeah. You might enjoy this, but like you just don't have the tools yet to really understand.
You don't
what
have
you're
like
playing.
the framework or the experience having played games like this.
Yeah,
already.
I mean, like it's not hard. Like it's not like we're like
no,
we're not like these Giga Brain
like,
Chads walking in with Dandan.
No, it's just
you
just like need this mental framework of like having played like close, like super dependent on position, like 1v1 games in formats before.
Where like tempo matters, card advantage matters, pressure matters, like all these things.
Yeah.
If you've never played a format like that, it kind of needs to be explained to you. Usually.
Yeah.
Some people are just nuts and figure it out.
You sort of after having played Magic for like a while, like it feels like it's sort of a blind spot for a lot of people of just like, you sort of like need people to explain the fundamentals of a control mirror to you a lot of the time. Like it's hard for a vast majority of the population to come up with the guidelines and the heuristics that actually guide the play in those matchups on their own. Yeah,
and when you play a good one, like I remember I played Lutri. I used to play Lutri in Modern for a couple months, and I played like a Lutri mirror against Blue-White in Modern, and it was like an hour-long game, was our only game we played, and I ended up winning. And I remember at the end of that being like, wow, I'm good at Magic. like I like this pile of garbage I'm piloting to have even had a chance to beat this like Blue-White player. I like really had to not make any mistakes this game. And I'm not actually that good at Magic, but sometimes you like
no, but that's sort of the feeling that winning a like really long drawn out like card advantage tempo mirror sort of brings out of you. It's just like I'm the best player to ever.
And that's what Dandan makes you feel like, which is why it's so fun. Because
exactly.
At the end you feel smart.
Dude,
and some people just want to feel smart.
When you get a massive blown... Yeah, wait, Morgan, you have a great quote about this, and I'm not going to do it justice.
Yeah, well, I think what I said was, Dandan gives you the highest, or like the greatest number of next levels per time spent playing.
That's really funny.
Of any. Like, that is just the whole format is just, like, next leveling back and forth.
And that's sort of the goal, is just to next level your opponent harder.
It definitely feels good when you like see something for the first time, and then it also feels amazing when you're teaching someone and you see them see something for the first time, and you're like, oh, I know you just connected the dots here about what's happening. I'm excited to see what you do with that, Especially when they're just disgustingly good at Magic, which occasionally, like, I work at SCG in Roanoke, there's a lot of people who are just really...
there's some people walking those halls that have some accolades.
Yeah, and you like play with someone. Suarez is one of those people where like you're like, oh, I didn't know you were like just absolutely sick at this game, like just absolutely nuts, and like you see them like the cogs turning in their head, and you're like, oh, you like get this on a level I don't. It's really cool. I've only beat Suarez once.
Cool.
It's like legitimately one of my proudest games of Dandan I've ever played.
that's amazing. I actually, dude, we haven't gotten out to that many like conventions or tournaments recently, but I actually just like super want to just get more Dandan in with like a like wide array of people, because it's just great like learning how people have their gameplay take on a weird format.
Yeah.
Where skill matters like a lot.
This is a bit of a like aside, but like I don't know if you remember like when people tried to get Commander Versus to play CDH like 7 years ago, and how it was a fucking nightmare.
God.
But when I started working at a SEG, like one of the things I figured out, which I didn't know, and I should have known, I just didn't, is that all the people on Commander Versus are like, well, I'm mostly thinking of Steven and Justin.
storied Magic.
Yeah,
players. Yeah,
they're like nutso, like just absolutely like.
People have played a lot of competitive.
Yeah,
Magic.
And like that's why they work at SCGs, because they love Magic. I mean, they might not anymore, but like there was a time. When,
yeah, there was a time.
There was a time where it was like their life. Like Suarez has a family now. He's just a guy. But like if I get to sit him down and play Dandan, it's like, oh, I play. It's like the best player I'm gonna play with this year. You know. And like he like again, like I mentioned earlier, he thinks of it like a Psychotog mirror, and like you could tell he's done a lot of this. You know.
Yep.
So it's really cool. Dandan's great because it's like a casual enough thing that people who like kind of have like don't want to take Magic seriously will play it, but they're still spiky enough that they can't help but take it seriously, and it makes it really fun.
Exactly. Yep. Cool. So I did want to get through just I have a couple more notes on like deck building missteps or like things that I think sort of make the format worse if you include them in a deck. I just run through them if people are sort of out at their own personal ones. I don't know. I end up being opinionated on game design stuff like this for no good reason. It's not like I have any actual experience doing game design or whatever. But you know, I play games. I like to have opinions. That's why I have a podcast.
Exactly.
So like a couple other big ones for me are like not including anything that even approximates a Howling Mine in the format.
Oh yeah.
Like I've seen people like sort of talk about like, oh, like what if I put in like a
reality
like
chip.
a Narset Part of the Veil or like reality chip or just like some like persistent card advantage engine, and I can think of like very few things that would make the game immediately unfun than having something that is like just asymmetrical value that just sort of sticks in play. Even if you're playing like, oh yeah, we'll play like, from your example, like we'll play like 2 reality chips and then like the mind bends can kill reality chips like all the time. I'm still not like at all a fan of that at all. It's just like, okay, because a lot of the time what this is gonna end up being is you're gonna play the value engine and then like they just don't have the removal spell and you just run away with the game. Whereas if it was the Dandan, like, okay, they have a few turns to find something. It's not producing advantage, it's just reducing my life total.
Wait, how can mind bends kill reality chips?
You just
Well, I was just saying,
the
like,
rules.
even if you agree that
Oh,
all
I see.
removal spells
Sure.
that can kill Dandans can kill like X repeat like
Sure.
recurring
Okay.
value
Okay.
engine.
I see. Yeah.
It's still not a fun experience at all because it's like now we're getting to like modern control mirror territory without any of the framework that makes those actually enjoyable to play. Right?
Okay.
Like you can have enjoyable like control mirrors in the current year with everybody playing like 3 fairies and big
Yeah, like,
fairies
can you imagine
and,
if like
all
there
these
was
things that
5 minutes
produce a
to
ton of
fairy
value?
Like that'd be awful.
Yeah, exactly. Like it just
God,
ends the game on the
no.
spot, right? Like it's just terrible.
Yeah.
It was funny. That was like I was gonna say there's no Teferi when you were like it's like an old school control mirror where there isn't like some big, card that's just gonna win you the game. I was literally gonna say like there's no
there's no
Teferi
Teferi.
Hero of Dominaria that you just
Or just like Teferi period, like just any Teferi card.
Yeah.
The only one that'd be close to acceptable is the 4 mana one that is like uptick loot, downtick
new one.
phase. Even that would just be way too good.
I think
Yeah.
the instant speed loot.
Oh, you're
on
right. That would be
would,
nuts. I'm sorry. I'm out of my
ruin
mind.
it completely. Yeah.
It's like, oh, are we gonna do anything in the end step? Oh, you memory lapsed something? Well, I guess I'll use this now. Otherwise,
Yeah,
I'll
that's like incredibly fucked up. I hadn't considered that.
I think what's okay. I do have two. You said nothing would ruin it for me more than like something like a reality chip.
Yeah.
I have two answers that I submit would ruin it more. The first is kind of just a joke, and that's glamour dye.
Yep. It's just okay. As long as anybody has lands in hand, we don't get to play the Dandan game anymore. We're just playing the control game.
But the actual one that I like thought about more seriously, but I think actually would be the worst on so many levels was Spellskite.
Oh god.
Yeah, it just ruins it completely.
And not only does it like ruin, all of the removal doesn't work and it's just like impossible to ever permanently deal with. It also breaks the 4 damage increments.
Yes. Because you can pay 2 life into it.
That would be awful.
I actually
Yes.
I had a couple of people initially. I think I actually have some worse ones, which are somebody at one point, I think they were doing it in a half joking way, but were sort of probing for what I thought about it. Suggested counterbalance, and I was just like, that is like one of the worst possible answers for this. Like, it's like, okay, cool. Here's this one card that as soon as you resolve, the game ends, and there's no.
It's
answer
like
to it
2/3 of the cards are 2-drops.
Yeah.
Oh.
And all of
the
the
deck
ones
is
that
all
matter.
top.
Alright, I
And
have
the
an
deck is
answer.
all top deck.
I have an answer. Sensei's Divining Top would just ruin the format.
Yep. So that was the other one that I was going to mention
Yeah.
that somebody had suggested to me, which is just
Someone actually did suggest that to me, and I
unreasonably
had to
terrible.
hold it in. The rage.
I was just like, it's possibly the worst card you could have picked in the entire game to include in the deck.
The whole format would be about
Yeah.
finding a top and then
Just having a top.
and making sure you're always drawing.
Yeah.
Like
Well, it's not you just have it in play, and you're just like, every time anything important happens, you're just like, okay, I'm just gonna pass with all of my mana up, and then I'm just
and you
gonna,
can
win the game
literally
'cause I'm just
activate top,
rearranging the top of the
tap
deck or
top,
whatever.
activate top, so that you get to draw the card you want, put
but
top on top, then put it second from the top.
I'd say even if top couldn't tap to draw and put itself on top, even if it was just look at the top 3 and
Yeah, it would be
rearrange
too
for a
good.
mana, that still ruins the
Yeah, I agree.
format on its own.
Honestly, I feel like even without the rearranging, obviously,
one
then
mana
it wouldn't
look
be
at the
enough,
top
but just
3.
literally
Yeah.
having perfect information on your opponent's draws would also just suck.
Even if it was just an artifact that said tap, put this on top of the deck, it might be too good. Honestly,
That at least there's interesting stuff there.
There
right?
is.
Because then you can't burn it early. If you do, your opponent gets access to it.
But,
and you have to
every
deal with your
memory,
opponent
can you
having it
imagine
for a bit, but
you play that on turn
yeah,
one, and then every memory lapse fight from that point on, you have to play around it. It'd be a nightmare.
it just sucks.
Yeah.
I think there are some more realistic. One of the things that I wanted to talk about in terms of how you could ruin it is, and I apologize, Braden, this may be a call out, is putting in actually good card advantage spells.
Oh yeah,
I remember there was discussion on Twitter about Factor Fiction. I don't remember if it was
it
you
was
who
Drake.
suggested
Drake
it.
plays 2-factor fiction, I think, in every version he's ever played.
That's
Okay.
That's
Well,
insane.
I agree.
I guess I'm calling out Drake then. Yeah, because I to me,
we haven't done
I
that
think
enough.
I think the the dynamic of diminishing returns being the only diminishing returns and accumulated knowledge being the only things that actually increase the number of cards in your hand.
Well, and predict, but
I guess
I have one that I wonder. I'll let you finish.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I think that's a very healthy dynamic, and Factor Fiction, because you can't really do anything about it other than just sort of stop it from happening, and there's no real downside. It just kind of feels like if you're a little bit ahead and then you have a Factor Fiction, you just
It is the
win game.
spikiest card you could probably possibly include.
it's also
Okay,
just
but what about Epiphany at the Drown Yard?
it's not even
X-cost Factor Fiction.
I feel like it gets it just gets out of spiky at that point, and in my opinion at least, is just too good to include though, because it's just this one card that will always be good as long as you can cast it. and is just like it will just dig you out of
I
holes
think
or like
there should be
put the
no
cap
card
on
in the
game
deck
immediately.
where if you mystical tutor for it, you're still like feeling great. You know what I mean? Like
Right, like
without context, right?
without
like,
context,
because
yeah.
if you
Like
take,
obviously mystical tutoring for vision charm when your opponent has 3
I just mean
Dandans,
like
or,
you're never just gonna like in a vacuum. This card's busted. Like take inventory is the closest, but again, not in a vacuum. Like you have to have the right cards in the graveyard, and you're opening yourself up a bit. But and mystical tutor always does that.
certainly having a target where you could just you could be like, I have like some space right now, I'm not under pressure, I'm just gonna mystical tutor for this card and then I'll have it later for when I need it.
Yeah, I mean,
I think that would be
You go
not a good
turn one
dynamic.
land, pass. Your opponent plays a temple. They scry. You mystical tutor for factor fiction. That's like messed up. That's like not okay.
Yeah, that's
Like,
so
really.
fucked up.
I just concede.
Yeah,
It's just
right?
like, no, yeah, you got it.
Yeah, just like,
Um,
cool. Like we could keep playing this game, but I'm gonna lose in 7
I have
turns. Like
I have a card advantage spell. I think you guys will like. It's a Chart a Course. I think that card is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so yes, but actually no. And actually, okay. Let's finish talking about card advantage spells, and then I'll explain why I don't like
Sure.
Chart a Course conceptually.
sure. But yeah, like you shouldn't. Yeah, the idea is that in order to generate card advantage, you need to either interact with your opponent or get the game state to a point where a conditional card can then gain you the advantage. Like it should just be very difficult to just go raw like 2-for-1.
Yeah, I agree.
Is I think like the more expanded version of that, like over just card.
I did have a card in the deck at one point, which is Memory Deluge, and that card was really close. Because it has flashback. There were a lot of games
so
I
you can sort of,
played
like,
where, where the person who gets to 7 lands first is often the same person who casts Memory Deluge, but it's not always. And there's enough Stone Rains and stuff, in the form of the Metamorphose, that it's actually an axis you can fight over. And if you cast the one from the graveyard and you weren't the person who cast the original Memory Deluge, you actually basically, and they're gonna memory lapse it or they lose. It actually then just becomes like a 2-for-2 because they lose the memory lapse, they lose the original Memory Deluge, and they got 2 cards off of the original Memory Deluge. So that card at least had some interesting play to it. But I mean, it's still too good. But
It still feels like, yeah, they come out ahead because either they got to spend 4 mana followed by
2 mana.
2 mana versus your 7 mana.
But it costs you
or
nothing
they get
because you're casting it from your grave.
No, but I'm saying like
just on
either
mana.
if you have a Memory Deluge and it resolves, then if you cast the one from the grave, then obviously you get massive card advantage even if it doesn't resolve.
Yeah.
And if the opponent casts it and you lapse or unsub it, then you got a pretty substantial mana advantage and went card neutral.
Sure.
And I think that's like both of those situations are really good for you, purely on the vector of you resolved a Memory Deluge.
Yeah. I think it, like, the fact it never does better than 2-for-1 is like a big deal versus Factor Fiction. And the fact it does open you up to some weird flashback stuff is also important. But
Yeah.
it's still probably too good. It's definitely too good if you're trying to make Dandans matter at all.
Yeah, which is sort of like some tension.
Yeah.
Which I guess we can now get back to the Chart a Course discussion, because Chart a Course is very much a card advantage spell that is trying to make Dandans matter.
Yeah, it has a goal. It has a very clearly, obviously stated goal, which is, hey, do you want to draw cards? You should play a Dandan. Which there's really nothing else like
So-
that.
And attack with it, get to untap
Yeah,
with
exactly.
it. Yeah.
So I think, yeah, this is we're getting into the dynamic that I haven't loved and I haven't thought of a good solution to.
Great.
Is blocking. Is like almost every time I'm being attacked with a Dandan, except in like very specific circumstances, it feels correct to block. And I think in my ideal version of Dandan, blocking would be correct like 70% of the time, and currently it feels like it's correct 90% of the
Sure.
time.
I think Charter Course helps there too.
I feel like you still just want to block because I guess if you specifically have a Charter Course, then you don't want to block, but like you want
Or
to
if you're ahead,
block.
I guess. Like if you're like very far ahead and you're like seeing more cards than your opponent is every
Well,
turn.
no, if you're very far ahead, you want to get their. I feel like if you're ahead, it's better to turn off their Charter Courses than yours.
Then turn on yours, sure.
Sure, that's possible.
Like because
well, theirs is already turned
the-
on, right? If they've gone to combat and they have a Charter Course.
Sure, but like if you just talk, if you're like, well, if they don't have it now, or like I have mana now, I can just memory lapse it or
Yeah.
whatever.
I mean, Charter Course
Like,
does something else,
and
too.
also it's better when you're ahead when it's turned off, right?
Yeah, I
like,
agree.
Anything like looting is better the more cards you have.
I do think though one of my biggest issues with Dandan is making your like fourth land drop, and Charter Course does actual like takes a real like dent in making it easier to make that fourth land drop. Because like being able to back up, you know, a Metamorphose with a Narcissus Reversal or a Memory Lapse, or you know, Memory Lapse something and then cantrip back what you lapsed is like really valuable. And so hitting 4 lands is like basically a minimum of any hand, which in reality is just never going to be the case. You're just going to have hands that sometimes just fail to do that. But Charter Course does a lot of work on turn 2 and letting you just like look at 2 cards, throw away a supplant form, and it mushes things up a bit. But I think that's okay. Also, there's a sick interaction where you discard Mystic Retrieval, which is like my favorite thing on earth.
Yeah, I was about to say.
So
you just
ditch
it to immediately cast
yeah.
it.
Every time you do that, you feel like a genius. So I don't know. I think Charter Course has been a net positive in my version of Dandan, but it is a card I avoided for a long time until I decided it did exactly what I want a card to do, which is make combat better and smooth land drops, and it does both.
I guess, yeah, I think I would like Charter Course with something else that disincentivized blocking. Is like where I'm at, because I definitely agree. Like the dynamics you're describing, the healthy dynamics you're describing, are ones that I think are good. I just like, for me, the experience I've had is just that like blocking is almost always the correct play, and I feel like until you alleviate that, Charter Course does some not as great things.
It's interesting.
I wonder. So I know you said you don't like have solutions for it, Morgan. Do you have like ideas of like classes of cards that would potentially encourage like less blocking in some situations?
I was thinking about like a spell that. I was thinking about like a spell that effectively just drew for how many Dandans were on the field. Could
so like 1,000
like,
arrows or whatever.
Yeah, but like obviously the ones that exist aren't like good enough. But just something like that, in that sort of vein, where like a card that would be bad if there are 2 Dandans on the field, but good in terms of card advantage if there are 3 Dandans on the field.
Is it like what? Like concerted defense? Am I remembering?
None of the card doesn't exist as far as I can tell. Like I looked,
sure.
and I couldn't find it, but yeah, like just that idea, or potentially some class of spells that are like discounted when you have a Dandan in play, or are more powerful when you have a Dandan in play, that I think like could make an interesting trade-off of.
I mean, Charter Course, that's the thing I'm not
as an
getting.
example,
It's like Charter Course does incentivize you to have a Dandan in play.
But the fact that like you need to, I think the problem is that like it doesn't, it incentivizes you to attack, which is like, which then just incentivizes them to block, and like that's sort of the issue that Like the only time, yes, it's an incentive exactly when you have Chart a Course in hand, Dandan in play, and you're being attacked. That is an incentive not to block. But I think that's not enough in my mind.
Yeah.
I guess
In the past, I just wouldn't play Dandans unless I had 8 cards in hand. Like other versions of Dandan ago. That was my like heuristic, is like only play Dandans when them crystal spraying would not put them up a card because you would have otherwise had to discard to hand size, right? Does that make sense? Like, you have 8 cards in hand. If you discard a card, they go up a card on you. But if you play Dandan and then the crystal spray, it stays where it's the same outcome effectively, but you might be able to like start applying pressure. And I feel like with Chart a Course, it at least gives you a reason before that point to play a Dandan, because you're like, oh, I might draw a Chart a Course, or I might even tutor up a Chart a Course or something like that. And having a Dandan in play already means that I get to play it now instead of waiting for it to come later. Or it might give you an incentive to memory lapse a Chart a Course, where otherwise you might just let it resolve. So.
Oh, okay. Actually, here's one that I think would help. Stubborn
Denial.
Oh.
I hate that card.
So the thing is, yes, it's technically like it does actually counter a spell and send it to the graveyard. However, it only does the non-creature spells, which I think is good. Like I think any counter spell that can send Dandan to the graveyard is very risky.
I agree.
Especially one that encourages you to have a Dandan in play, where it's like the play pattern is I play my Dandan and then I counter your Dandan for 1 mana, and now we're in a place
like
where,
I think it's specifically best at protecting Dandan. I was actually thinking, though I just said that a counter spell that can hard counter a Dandan is dangerous. I am actually interested to try Supreme Will, which is
these are all cards
3 mana for...
they scare me. I don't want any hard counter spells. I don't want any.
I mean, it's a mana leak, so it's not.
I don't want any card that says counter target spell. It goes to the graveyard. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, that's fair.
So this is one of Braden's lines, right? So this, like I was talking earlier about, like I'm not a huge fan of searching. Braden, very obviously not a fan of like hard counter magic.
Yeah,
it's just like super understandable.
It just, the whole point of the format is you're gonna have to fight over these like niche interactions, and like it just going to the graveyard means the fight is over, you know?
I find it extremely funny that we're like, because of the peculiarities of this format, Force Spike would be classed as a hard
it would
spell.
Be. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like where in every other format that would be like the quintessential soft counter spell.
Yeah. It is weird. But like Unsubstantiate, for example, like
but it makes sense.
I love squeezing the counter spell out of Unsubstantiate.
Oh, dude,
it's so fun.
Unsubstantiate is like so the deck is built around memory lapse and requires memory lapses to function. Unsubstantiate is so much more fun.
Oh yeah, I mean,
but it's fun because of the structure built by the memory lapses.
Yeah,
but within that structure, it's so much more fun than the memory lapses.
Oh yeah, but you also like, can you imagine if there were 4 of them?
Oh yeah, it would be terrible.
It'd be
like
awful.
You don't want anything more than 2 of
it's
them.
It's just a little taste.
It's just chef's kiss. Yeah, exactly.
Like every time you like get in a counter battle and they like go, you play a spell, they memory lapse it, you memory lapse back. And then they like have another counter spell, and you just go like, I'll just unsub my original spell, and I'll also draw one of those memory lapses you just put on top of the deck. It's great.
It's so good.
Yeah.
Also, I mean, the classic also like unsubbing into the wheel, but that's
Oh yeah, of course.
You get that everywhere, but unsubbing into
Cal and I played a game over at Philly that was recorded, and where the last play of the game is unsubbing a mind bend. Well, he has no mana up, and then I just get in for lethal.
Nice.
It's like, perfect. You know?
Oh, that's so great, because that just doesn't happen that often.
No, it's so
Either.
rare, especially mind
bend.
bend.
To hand them, they can't cast it again.
Yeah. And the notes for the game actually say like Braden unsubstantiates his Dandan and Cal concedes, and I'm like, oh, that's not what's happening. Like, It's actually happening is the
Yeah.
unsub on the mind bend's just closing the door.
This is
Exciting.
great. Cool. So I think we've spent a fair amount of time talking about the construction of Dandan decks in terms of like broad categories of things, which is, I mean, great. We could probably continue talking about that, but we're not going to hold Braden hostage. I mean, we're not holding him hostage. He's talking about
I love
Dandan. He's
Dandan,
basically
yeah.
in his favorite place right now.
I'm in my happy
this is,
place.
like,
I've got
what
to do
Braden
so
would
much of
want.
it
Yeah.
lately. It's awesome.
Like, let's be real. He would just get into the windowless van if you just said, hey,
Yeah,
do you want to play some Dandan?
It is-
Hey, you want to play talk about Dandan for a couple of hours?
It is crazy. Like, there's a large content creator. I don't want to say who because I don't want to spoil anything. Who's making a Dandan video? There's the artist for Dandan, Drew Tucker, just did the Dandan set of tokens, which are like beautiful works of art.
Yeah, which is fantastic.
Playing with Power recorded some Dandan at Philly. Hopefully that's not too much of a spoiler. They're also huge, right? There's tons of people who are like making Dandan content right now, and they're all talking to me, and I'm like, ha ha ha, I'm the Dandan guy. How can I help? It's awesome.
I'm Dan. I'm not Braden. I'm Dan.
I'm the Dandan guy. I also got a Dandan tattoo, so yeah, it's been fucking dope. It's been fun.
That is dope, actually. I think I think a CDH tattoo would be sort of cringe for like anybody, honestly. A Dandan.
Yeah, I do not have a CDH tattoo.
I think that's fantastic.
I was part of the CEDH cast. No CEDH tattoo. Have played Dandan for 1 year. Have a Dandan tattoo.
Dandan
It's
too.
just for those listening. It's
What
just
it-
the numbers
what it gets
4
you,
and
it gets
1.
you.
That's all it is.
Which is great. I mean, that's.
Oh yeah, I really like tattoos when they're nerdy, like magic nerdy. Having tattoos that are just like totally meaningless outside of like
yeah.
being way too into it.
Yep. Fully agree. But yeah, so aside from broad deck construction and sort of like gameplay and game design and such and all that kind of stuff, let's talk about some specific cards, huh?
Sure.
Just open floor for some stuff that you're a fan of that isn't potentially in the stock list, but that like you're either a fan of and really like to play, or would like to test, or would really like to be able to put in a Dan deck without completely ruining it.
Got it. I have so many cards.
One that I'm like super interested in, and I think it would probably ruin the deck. I think it would be a net negative. But Una's Grace,
Oh,
I think
God.
is like sort of interesting, and I think in the default Dandan deck it would ruin the Dandan deck. But I think there's probably a way out there to build a version of Dandan that looks like significantly different from the ones that are currently being played with, where like Una's Grace is a balanced card and is like a core part of the gameplay.
I think what you would do is there's the bounce spells from Khans of Tarkir that have Delve. You play those.
Oh, so you can delve it out of
Yeah.
the bin. Yeah, but I'm sort of thinking about more of like it's just a persistent way that you can exchange mana and a land in your hand.
Oh,
for
just like almost like a
rebuy
companion
both
esque
players.
where you can just like be like, yeah, discard a land.
Or like you just like start with it, like yeah, or like an effective version of that where there are like 2 Una's Graces in the deck and it's built around that interaction happening consistently.
Interesting.
I just think it would be super cool just because it's like one of those things where it's like it's retrace, so it's persistent and it just like sticks around, but both players can leverage it if they need to.
Yeah. The weird thing is, are there 2 copies in the graveyard? Or are there infinite copies in the graveyard?
yeah, exactly. Which is like something that you'd have to figure out if you were actually going to play it.
Because if there's 1 copy, once the first person plays it,
Can...
that's it. So until it resolves.
Wait, what? No, it's retrace.
Well, it's on the stack.
Oh, well, it's on the stack.
Yeah,
sure.
so yeah. But if you have infinite copies in the graveyard, each player can just keep discarding lands to cantrip.
You just like keep doing it. Yeah.
Interesting. I have one I've been looking at, which is Gone Missing. It's 5 mana for a sorcery. I have it right here. Put target permanent on top of its owner's library, so it's very similar to Metamorphose, except it's 5 mana and a sorcery. And then you investigate, which means you create a clue artifact token with 2 sacrifice, draw a card. 5 mana. There's no 5 mana spells in the deck right now, which for aesthetic reasons makes me interested in it. And then I really like land destruction in Dandan, like a lot. And 5 mana feels
I think
right.
I think we all agree. I think specifically Morgan, but I definitely like hold this opinion, and you also do as well. Of the Metamorphose the play patterns around Metamorphose being like some of the most interesting ones that you can get into in the cube in general. And I think adding more of that is like a really interesting idea.
Yeah, I think 4 is probably the most you'd ever want. And at 5 mana, it starts to not be worth doing. Where at 2 mana, it's like very obviously worth doing. But at 7 mana, like put a permanent on top of the deck, draw it, because you just sack the clue for 2. That starts to be a really interesting interaction. It gets kind of close to a mind control, which is a card I've considered in the past.
But then also the bankability of the card draw.
It's
makes
very
it a lot
powerful. It's
right?
probably
Where
a little too good.
Like if you don't need the card immediately, and you're sort of just like maybe like bouncing a tap land or something to put your opponent off of mana, or like just like getting a Dandan out of play for a turn, and then you could bank it for later, like the Stack Wars and stuff.
For sure. It's an interesting card.
I feel like that. I like the dynamic of like fully killing a Dandan takes more than one card, and I like it makes me a little nervous of like that's another one of those ones where it's like if you're ahead and you can just resolve that, then the game ends, right? That makes me.
It is a 7 mana 2 for 1, which is like
it is a 7 mana.
No, but that's not a bad. That's what I'm not saying. Can you believe it's 7 mana? I'm saying like in Dandan, a 7 mana clean 2 for 1 is like above rate, maybe. Like it
is about contained in a 1-card package where you don't have to combine things together, right? Like I think that is above rate, decidedly. But is it okay?
I mean, Mystic Retrieval's
like is that
Mystic Retrieval's 7 mana.
spiky?
That there's the making of red mana, but it's not that hard.
Yeah.
So it's close. Not perfect, but close.
Honestly, like the games that end with someone just resolving both halves of a Mystic Retrieval are like some of my least favorite games, I think.
Yeah.
So,
actually, yeah, sorry. I know we sort of skipped over that. Morgan, do you want to get into your gripes with both like mana coloring and in general Mystic Retrieval? Because I know that you probably want to.
I mean, so like Mystic Retrieval is something that I'm like waffly on. I think the gripe that you're referring to that I've referenced most is with Is It Boilerworks?
Yep.
Where I think that like it's cool to have the land that returns a land and like is 2 land drops for 1, but has the risk of getting metamorphosed or whatever, and like obviously it's awkward because one of the mana isn't blue, so you can't play Dandan off it. There's a bunch of stuff that it stops you just paying the double blue with. But I think the fact that you want to get red mana should be decoupled from that dynamic. Like I would rather put in maybe 2 or even 4 more blue-red tap lands and play like growth chambers or whatever.
Have you ever like mind-bended your island to play retrieval?
I don't think so, because almost every time someone retrievals, they just instantly flash it back, has been my experience.
Yeah, I meant like you have 8 mana, your opponent's tapped out, you don't have any red sources, so you pay 4 mana basically to exile. You're basically paying 4 mana to exile the retrieval by, first you get back your mind bend, then you mind bend a land, then you get the card you actually want. That way you can't like give your opponent the free card. I've done that before, but
it does make sense. But it's also like I feel like a lot of the time, it's rare that happens without like a fight.
Oh yeah, it's not like a common.
Like it's yeah.
It's not common.
It's like it's hard to get it to a point where like you have a Mystic Retrieval in hand and like a bunch of mana and your opponent's fully tapped out.
Yeah, I agree. It's usually after a fight over Mystic Retrieval, to be fair.
Yeah. It's over the first one, and then you just like have the shit-eating grin on your face as you show your opponent the second one.
Yeah.
or they try and Mystic Retrieval, and then they lose the fight, and then you just untap.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
I gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like I think the original version of the deck was on Coral Atoll instead of the Growth Chamber. or not Growth Chamber rather, but Boilerworks.
I really like Boilerworks. I'm a big defender.
Yeah, I think Coral Atoll has problem. I mean, like obviously it has problems. There's a reason why nobody plays it in any format anymore. Having to only making colorless blue and then also having to return an untapped island is rough. But like I think if like Coral Atoll, yeah, like if Coral Atoll existed that could bounce like tapped lands as well, I think that would be interesting. I think
There's
also like maybe
the Guild of the Commons.
if you could
try that.
Yeah, I was more
Wait,
thinking
that's
though, like
double colorless though.
it's double colorless. I was thinking though that like Coral Atoll, if you didn't have to bounce an untapped island, I think would actually be a really interesting spot in terms of power levels, because you would have this like bounce land that's technically card advantage, because the bounce lands are card advantage, and very much like this is probably one of the formats where they show their card advantage the most a lot of the time.
I agree.
Where I think not being able to bounce the non-basic or like the non-island lands, but still being card advantage is really interesting. Because like I think like we've had a lot of discussions. Like I think we're like at least I'm of the opinion that like Halimar Depths is one of the best cards in the deck.
Oh, I agree.
And
it's like
being able to like
in the
Halimar
basic
Depths
lane
and then
it's like...
yeah, exactly. But like being able to like have this Is It Boilerworks that already fixes mana and is card advantage on its own, and then being like, okay, without casting any spells in like a almost uninteractable way, I'm going to Boilerworks, return this to Halimar Depths, and I'm just going to Depths you next turn again.
Yeah, I mean,
it's just like
that's
like that's very it's very spiky, and it's like it's within obviously 2 cards is within, it's interactable, you can like metamorphose stuff to like turn all of that stuff off, but it's like that specific play pattern inches a bit close to too strong for me. So I think like having a way to like have the play patterns of the bounce lands without being able to replicate specifically that would be interesting.
Yeah, I think it's something I've definitely put a lot of time into thinking about, because it is like the net of like, I mean, like this intertwined net of like card advantage and mana selection and the Dandans not being able to attack if you don't have any islands. Like all of this weaves together in a very interesting way. And outside of Mystic Sanctuary, Floodplain, and Odawara, which I've done some testing with Odawara, I'm not really willing to edit the mana base all that much. It is it's a very complicated thing, and I think if you mess with it,
very well thought through at a base level.
It's probably Nick Floyd's like biggest achievement in this entire deck, to be honest, or whoever made the Boilerworks mana base.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, like it is like you feel it, like it's sort of invisible when you start playing Dandan, and as you play it more, it's like, wow, this like just playing the lands here all like works together in like really
it's a huge part
interesting
of
and satisfying ways. Yeah,
it's actually one of the things I think is the most magic-y of the game. The fact that mind bends and the magical hacks can change the land types, and the fact that you care about the second color just a little bit, and the fact that Dandan cares about basics versus non-basics, is all the sort of stuff you would cut from any board game you made based off of Dandan. None of that would remain, but it adds a ton of just like grooves into this like larger experience that I think is generally beneficial.
Morgan, do you have any cards that you we haven't mentioned yet that you think are hot?
One thing I've like thought about, I forget who I saw mentioning this, but I was like, that seems neat. Curious if you ever tried it, Braden, because I know you you certainly spent more time than we have tinkering with the list.
Actually, like playing it and tinkering.
Was mission briefing?
I've never tried that. Seems very good. Like very, very
but
good.
Like it is like kind of maybe you couldn't do it. Maybe you'd have to do it in a version that didn't have like the AKs, or at least they'd have to be take inventories.
Yeah, I mean we're gonna get into that later, I'm sure, but
but like I don't know, just rebuying a spell, exiling it permanently is like a sort of an interesting concept, and like I don't know, it doesn't seem like too strong, you are still you're paying blue up front for like basically nothing, and then you get to cast a spell from the graveyard, and like the spells aren't actually that good. So
I think
I don't know. It seemed like I also like just generally the concept of surveil and effects like it seems kind of interesting to me. I don't actually have like a great example of one that I think would be good, like for like I don't necessarily think that like putting consider in would be good, but I just think like the concept of actual, not just like choosing who gets which cards, but a worse rated cantrip type effect that actually got rid of some cards.
Like
Could be, like,
otherworldly
an interesting-
gaze.
Sorry,
Otherworldly gaze.
which was that
Surveil.
one?
The one
Oh,
mana,
Surveil.
the
Sure,
blue
yeah, yeah.
instant with flashback 1 and a blue.
I mean,
Surveils 3.
Yeah, something like that, or just like one of the like Tygam scheming, or one of those like surveil fives.
Right.
I think those are probably just not good enough.
yeah, I think the
'cause
issue with a lot of these
they're
cards
sorceries, but
is that they don't replace themselves, and in Dandan, that's just like so
A death sentence.
tough.
Yeah.
Now, mission briefing,
yeah, which is
a
why
cantrip basically. So, like, it's basically like it's like if you took the flashback off of Mystic Retrieval. Am I thinking Mystic Retrieval? Yeah, that's the name of the card. You have to play the card this turn, but you're probably playing a 2-drop because the entire deck's made up of 2-drops. And you get some deck manipulation, so you can theoretically play it like during a counter to war battle, you could like let a memory lapse go to the top, cast this, mill the memory lapse, then memory lapse. I think that'd be interesting. This is a card worth testing for sure. I would probably cut the Mystic Retrievals. Then without the Mystic Retrievals, though, the
Yeah.
whole mana base starts getting kind of weird, and you start being like, well, why is this here? Why is this here? So
I mean,
I'm very
yeah, but also, like, I think even if you look at the doc from Nick, I think he actually mentions in like some of the designer's notes that he's like, yeah, so, like he wanted to add a scry land to the deck, but there's no blue version of New Benalia, so forced to use one of the dual color temples. He went through spells to see if there was anything with a color identity of both blue and another color that could replace a spell in the deck. So this actually backs up what we've been talking about. Of the Temple of Epiphany actually came before the Mystic Retrieval in the deck, with the Mystic Retrieval sort of being like added in as a justification for the Temple of Epiphany going in. And then, yeah, but like definitely talking about it here. And I think this is probably something that like I don't think has been touched that much, but is maybe something worth thinking about, is that he actually mentions like none of he mentions some like other split color cards and saying that none of them would adequately replace a spell to my liking, but the Temple and Guild Bounce land could change if a new card is printed with another color identity, or you just like some card better in your own deck. So I think actually like potentially just like playing around with swapping Mystic Retrieval out for like a card that's another color, and then just like swapping the entire mana base over to that color could be like
green is the one I think is the most likely, and then white after that.
Yeah,
you have Azorius Charm in white, which is pretty messed up.
and
then in green you have Reclaim, and then there's a 3-mana version of what's it called? Like, you know, the Metamorphose effect. It's 1 green blue. Put a permanent on top of the owner's library.
Oh, Temporal Fissure. Yeah. do you know why I know that one?
Why?
Because I have played it in Pauper.
Oh, cool. So yeah,
actually to relative success, but anyway.
Cool. I think those are the 2 colors I mean, there's only 3 other options.
No, Temporal Fissure's the one with Storm. You're derping.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. It's Temporal. Anyway, I'll find it. You keep talking.
But yeah,
Temporal Spring.
Sure.
Go.
I think those, so Reclaim and Temporal Spring, I think, are the reason to be in green. I think green actually has a shockingly high number of top of deck cards.
Yeah, honestly.
But I think I think Mystic Retrieval's dope. I think having a card that makes you tap out for 7 is pretty cool. Because there needs to be a reason for you to tap out on your turn in like the 10th turn. And I think Mystic Retrieval kind of gives you an excuse to do that. And I also think people just like blue red. Like I like the aesthetic of Temple of Epiphany and Is It Blur Works, and they all have old border versions because they were printed and stuff like that. At a certain point, we are playing like a silly little format, and like I can just be like, I like old border stuff. It's easier to do that in blue red. I'm gonna stick with blue red.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Yeah,
it's also like there's sort of the aesthetic of or maybe not aesthetic, but like it's sort of like lodged in anybody who's been playing Magic long enough and has played like Eternal formats brains of like blue red being the Delver colors.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's very like gameplay tends to be very Delverish. You have like this threat that you have to defend that doesn't really do any. I mean, it's broken from New School Delver, but I'm not talking about New School Delver. I'm talking about good old classic Delver of like you have these threats. They don't really do anything aside from just being efficient and getting damage in on their own, and the entire deck revolves around trying to keep them in play and playing the card advantage game around them.
Yeah.
And it just fits very nicely with that. Cool. So I guess actually spinning off of some of that discussion as well. I did want to get into a small sort of section as well about just the least favorite cards that we have for current brews and current build of the deck. I know we all probably have a pretty yeah.
Yeah. there's some stinkers in the original list.
Yeah.
I think we could all agree.
Yeah. So the big ones I think for all of us are specifically Rave Command and Dance or God, what is it?
Dance of the Skywise.
Yeah. They're just like you play with them and you like very quickly realize that it's like, oh, these are like the things that I'm going to misculture at the top of the deck when I don't want my opponent to draw a card. It's just like, here, have this Dance of the Skywise as a dead draw because it's literally just not going to do anything.
Yeah, it's funny how often that's like a reasonable thing to do. Like when those cards are in the deck, you're like, oh, I'm not going to play a Dandan this entire game because Crystal Spray's in the deck and I don't want to give you the 2-for-1. So here, take this Ray of Command because that'll be useful.
Yeah, well, just in general, just like, oh, Halimar Depths, cool, I'll leave this Ray of Command on top.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Like, just, yeah, you just, like, it's like, basically just, like, 4 cards in the deck that are effectively just dead cards that you're just giving your opponent. And it's, like, they're dead cards that, they're not even islands, so you don't even have to risk your opponent getting a hit on mana on you or getting up on land drops on you. You're just, like, this is just going to be useless because I know that it's in your hand, and that makes it useless by virtue of happening.
Yeah.
I think... What I was thinking about Dance of the Skywise, which is, for those who aren't familiar, is it loses all abilities, becomes a 4/4 with flying. So I guess, like, the secret mode is you can force 4 damage through if they have a Dandan to block with. But what I was thinking would be, like, would make it a reasonable card, would be if it made Dandan into a 4/5. So then at the very least, like, Dance of the Skywise plus a Dandan, like, kills their Dandan, and you get to keep yours.
Yeah. I mean, I think the real thing that ends up doing that is interesting is, like, forcing combat tricks to happen before blocks. And I'm not sure that actually makes the game more fun. You know what I mean? Or actually, no, it doesn't. You just wait for them to go to block, then dance to save their team, and you kill it. Yeah, that is actually really
God, if there was a... It's like a... God, yeah, if Dive Down gave like an extra point of toughness, it would be like the perfect like the perfect replacement for it. But
Dive Down would be,
I guess,
sick.
Being at 1 mana is like probably too much. Maybe not. I don't know. That might require testing. But like Dive Down, if it gave like +0/+4 in hexproof, would be like sort of what you're talking about there, like being like an actual reasonable combat trick where you can like block. Like it encourages blocking. You want to block with it, and it also stops Dandans from dying to removal.
Yeah.
And then good old Ray of Command. If anybody's not aware, Ray of Command is it's not great. I originally printed in 5th edition, I think, or Ice Age, right?
Yeah,
Ice Age.
There's nothing originally in 5th.
Yeah. Ice Age, which is an instant speed threaten. For 4 mana, which is just like almost never good. The reason why Ray of Command would be good Like the perspective reason is obviously if your opponent attacks with 2 Dandans, you would be able to rave command one of them and then block the other one. The issue is that you just like never want to have 2 Dandans in play anyway because Vision Charm exists.
Yeah,
like people are already incentivized to not play into the one situation where rave command is actually like consistent.
And you might think like, hey, well, once you cut Vision Charm, you might want Rave Command, but it's like, well, the reason I'm cutting Vision Charm is so people want to play 2 Dandans at once. I wanted it to be free to put pressure on board.
Yeah.
So by adding Rave Command, I'm just reinforcing this behavior I don't want to exist, even if it's lighter, because like probably not gonna get blown out by Rave Command most of the time.
Which like you might be able to justify it just by saying like it's 3 more mana than Vision Charm and requires them to actually attack with both rather than them just like existing on the board. But it's still like
it's like, why did I cut Vision
bad
Charm?
Incentives,
you know? I didn't cut Vision Charm so I could play Rave Command. I cut Vision Charm.
I cut Vision Charm because I didn't want to play Vision Charm.
Exactly.
Which actually, okay, I think this is probably a good point to actually hop into this discussion real quick. We'll just hop back and forth, whatever. About sort of like I think what is like one of the clearest demarcations of like the split between like a control oriented Dandan deck and a tempo oriented Dandan deck. We talked about this a bit in pre-show. Which is like basically boils or like the most apparent symptom or like outward showing of that split is with the inclusion of Vision Charm or the exclusion of Vision Charm. It tends to be that the Dandan decks with a Vision Charm in them tend to be a lot more controlling because there's just inherent pressure on you to not commit too many Dandans to the board at one time because like you can just get blown out for 1 mana in instant speed. So you're almost always just going to play at trying to be +1 Dandan on your opponent. So if they have 1 in play, you might be able to get 2 in play. But a lot of the time, you're just going to have a single Dandan in play, even if you have 1 in hand to play out.
And even
whereas,
then,
like as soon as you take that away,
if you can't like grasp like how like warping of the format Vision Charm is, imagine if there was a 1 mana instant speed board wipe in Standard. Like,
yes,
what kind of threats would see
like,
play?
okay.
They would not be vanilla 4 ones. They would be like creatures that enter the battlefield and like draw 3 cards. You know.
Or more realistically, you just wouldn't play.
Yeah,
creatures.
you just would never. You never would. But you'd only play
Yeah.
creatures that like have impact on board beyond their body. And in Dandan, there's no creatures like that for obvious reasons. So
do you want to talk about why you're more partial to the tempo builds?
I don't know if I personally am.
You are.
It's more just like
No,
I want my Dandan to
Do you
be
think it's
fun for as
healthier?
many people as possible. And when I play with
Sure.
Drake, I have a lot of fun with like fact or fiction and stuff. But I play with a variety of people who have different interests, and I think I like take joy in feeling like I'm being a good game designer and like making a cool game that's interesting and has layers that people enjoy. I take pride in that, and I think the tempo version is the most accessible. It is the most fun to the most people. It is the one with the furthest depth and the least heuristics, and that's like a really interesting thing to have. And also, I want my opponents to play with me, so what their opinion is matters quite a bit.
Sure, 100%.
Yeah. So I really like
Um,
Memory Journey and Fact or Fiction and stuff, but I just think most people don't, and the feedback I get tends to agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, makes sense. Like, it's especially like if people are coming from, like formats, or at least like coming from decks or like expertises or like styles of play where creatures are much more the focus. It makes sense to build the deck such in a way where you actually get to play the creatures as the focus of the deck versus the spells.
And if you think about it, like
The
the 3 of us, that is not exactly our background.
No,
So
I wouldn't say so.
It makes sense that we would not be as partial to that, even if we enjoy it.
Yeah, and I mean it is a perfectly enjoyable. I mean, it's a perfectly enjoyable way of building the deck because like I like there's a reason why I enjoy playing like Standard Draft every once in a while. There's a reason why I enjoy playing like lower power formats. It's because like the combat step is really interesting and really fun a lot of the time because it was sort of designed to be that way. That's what the game runs on in the formats that like aren't CDH. which I don't know. I don't know if our viewers would or listeners would agree that combat is fun, but combat is fun, man.
Honestly, very optimistic of you to assume that we have listeners at this point.
At this point, yeah, seriously. We should give out a passphrase at the like 3/4 point of the episode or whatever for anybody that got through it.
Like, hey, if everyone, at some point during the episode, we will give you the answer to one of the questions on next week's test. So make sure you listen to the whole thing.
All the way through it. Cool. Yeah, I think so. I think we got through most of like the structured content that we sort of had on show notes, and we are pushing it a bit on runtime, but I will sort of open it up. I know Braden specifically, me and Morgan have sort of talked through a lot of our thoughts on Dandan already. So I think we've covered a good amount of that. But if you have like some burning stuff that you want to get through,
I have a gut check for us. If we want to do a gut check.
Oh sure. If
hell yeah.
Okay, if we want to do a gut check, then we will cap off the main topic there. Which I think was good. I think we got through a lot of Dandan. I think we're like pretty solidly are now at like probably the most comprehensive piece of Dandan content ever created.
God bless.
We'll probably be overthrown at some point in the near future based on how popular the format is getting, which is a great thing. But we'll hold that title for however shortly we will be. So
I'm glad I could assist.
Thanks for listening for main episode. Thanks for hopping on for that one, Braden. And then we're gonna hop into our other stuff now, which I know everybody's coming back from the their hiatus from the. Oh god, I have to listen to Dan. Never mind. Call me back when gut check's happening. Well, gut check's happening. So, Braden, why don't you let us know what it is? If you want to, first of all, give us the story behind this gut check, and then
I messaged Cal at 5:02 p.m. on March 22nd. Can you give me a gut check question? Cal went, "Oh shit, and then the gut check question. Are we ready, team?"
Well, I think the context of this is also we were hoping to have Cal on as well for this episode, and because we're crap at scheduling, we sort of left it just too late. And
Cal's also like the busiest person in the universe, so
for sure. And we reached out like a month ago, and it was like, yeah, good idea. And we reached out a week ago, and Cal was like, I'm booked till the end of April. I was like, oh.
Oof.
Sag.
Well, so this is Cal's voice making its way into the episode.
All right. I feel like I've had too much time to look at the message, so I'll wait until you guys answer.
You're fine. Just run it.
Accumulated knowledge or take inventory? Go.
I am gonna go with accumulated knowledge.
I'm all in on take inventory. I mean, I'm bought, sold, paid for.
Yep.
I think I'm gonna say take inventory. I haven't actually played with it, but I feel like it would like some of the dynamics I don't like about accumulated knowledge feel like they would be alleviated some point.
Can I sell y'all on take inventory?
Oh, go for it.
There are two axes.
I'll let you know what my reasoning is afterward.
Sure. There are two axes on which Dandan is played. Pressure in the form of tempo and other things. And, well, the pressure, I guess I should say, there's two forms of pressure in Dandan. That's probably a better way of putting it. There's your life total in the form of getting hit by Dandans, and there is card advantage. By forcing both forms of pressure to be played on your turn, when considered alongside the existence of the memory lapse interaction, means that anytime you want to pull ahead and one of the primary resources that are used to close out the game, you have to make a decision on your turn and open yourself up to memory lapse. And that is a good thing.
So I fully agree with all of that reasoning. In fact, I am a staunch advocate for the I think I don't think it was ever officially named or anything like that, but the Patrick Sullivan's Baneslayer test, which is like if Baneslayer is good in a format, that's a good sign because there's tension with a Baneslayer Angel, right?
Yes.
Where there isn't with something like a Ravenous Chupacabra. You play something like a Ravenous Chupacabra and you immediately get your thing as soon as it resolves. And then you don't really care what happens to the body, or like you get the body, but the body doesn't really matter. There's tension involved with the Baneslayer Angel. You have to spend a whole 5 mana on this thing that doesn't do anything immediately, and you have to get a whole turn cycle around to untap with it. So you have to be super confident that you're going to be able to like get your next turn with this Baneslayer Angel in play, or at least like get a favorable exchange on it or something. And that's good. It's good that you have to like have like suspense about all that stuff. And I think it like a very similar line carries over to Dan here. Or like, it's basically the same line of like there needs to be tension. You need to be incentivized to take risks and like play cards that just by virtue of playing them have risks attached, i.e. in this format doing stuff at sorcery speed. I fully agree. My reasoning for why I like accumulating knowledge is because it just allows for way more next leveling. I think take inventory is the objectively healthier card for the Dandan format. I think accumulated knowledge ends up with far better blowouts, and that's what I'm interested in.
That's a very reasonable take. It's a shockingly reasonable take because it sounds like an insane thing to say, but the format is kind of about that. For example, like the thing I think about is the interaction between Narset's Reversal and Take Inventory. It is unbelievably gross that you can have 3 accumulated knowledges in the graveyard, play the 4th, reversal it to your hand, play the 4th again, then draw 5 cards off the copy. And you're up like 9 cards or 8 cards, some ridiculous
for 2
number.
cards passed.
That's awful. But also when you do it, you're like, I'm the best Magic player who's ever lived.
This fucking rocks. This is great.
So yeah, I see where you're coming from.
For full context again, remember everybody listening that I'm the person who, like, I will take the lines that involve activating Thrasios the most, and when my opponents are like, no, I think we're done here. I'm like, no, wait, let me have a couple of more turn cycles with this Seedborn Muse. So,
just a few more, man, I need this.
Accumulating.
I need these Thrasios activations to get through my week, guys.
Exactly.
Yeah, sure.
All right. You know what? Thank you, Cal. Very appropriate gut check and also very quizzable. So that's much appreciated. They're already doing a better job than Lyndon.
Wow,
which is great.
Brutal, just savage. All right,
I gotta get a jab in because Lyndon is also very sad that he couldn't be on the podcast with Braden. Braden, I'm sure we can get you on at some point.
Oh, I'm
some point later.
I'm a slut for some talking about things I like.
we would be more than happy to have you on again, so we'll try to get you on with Lyndon at the same time.
Unfortunately, Lyndon hates Dandan, so
no,
we might have to come up with something else.
Have to find.
Does he like the basic land game at least?
Okay, I'm gonna be honest. I don't actually know. Lyndon decided he was gonna hate Dandan before he tried it, and then he tried it and told us he hated it, and I'm still not sure how legitimate that was.
That is some fucking shit posting I'd expect out of him. I don't know
it's a very
if I trust him on that one. I'll have to go up to Toronto and bully him into being honest.
Dude, do it. Next time there's an SCG in Canada, which is probably never, but just come up solely to you actually. There's an SCG in Toronto. You're not even here to work it. You take the day off, come up, and come here just to.
I just take the day off. I take the airport. I fly in Saturday morning. I'm out Saturday night. I'm just there to bully. Yeah, that sounds like a plan.
Yeah, 100%. Cool. So in terms of gut check, again, as always, this gut check will be put up in our gut check channel on the Discord. So if anybody listening wants to go vote and see what everybody else thought about our answers for the gut check this week, go do that. And then we also have all of our previous gut checks in that channel as well that you can go vote on and engage with and do all that good stuff and see what everybody else thought about them. So go do that if you haven't. But that actually wraps it up for our content for our episode. So thanks y'all for joining. I'm going to very quickly thank Braden and also ask that he once again does any more shilling that he wants to before we close out.
Yeah, again, I'm Braden. You just heard me talk about Dandan for 2 hours and you stuck around. So that means you definitely want to follow my Twitter account, BradenMTG, where I never stop talking about Dandan. And then also you can check out my content on TikTok, YouTube, or Instagram on the Star City Games channel. It's Market Movers. We talk about which cards are going up, cards are going down, what cards I think will go up, cards I think will go down. I try to get people to yell at me as much as possible. It's a great time. Content rules.
Hell yeah. Again, thanks so much for making the time, hopping on.
Of course.
Much appreciated. Well, we'd love to have you on in the future. But that about wraps it up for this episode. If anybody would like to reach out to us with any questions, comments, or concerns, you can contact us on Twitter at Into the North Pod, via our email at intothenorthpodcast@gmail.com, or on our Discord server, the invite link for which can be found in the description for this episode. An extra special thanks goes out to all of our patrons who help cover the expenses for our show and allow us to work toward improving the quality of the podcast. If you too would like to become a patron, we're at patreon.com/IntoTheNorthPodcast. Thank you, as always, to the band of Vox Cadre for our lovely podcast music, and to Nate Slover for our equally lovely podcast logo. The next episode will be out in 2 weeks. Until then, see ya.
Bye.